The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Housing is an issue that affects everyone in suburban Hennepin County. Our guests today, Karen Kingsley, Maxine Timm, and Charlie Warner, are on the staff of CASH, Community Action for Suburban Hennepin. This Minnesota nonprofit agency works with suburban Hennepin County residents on affordable housing issues. Karen, Charlie, and Maxine, it's a pleasure to have you here on All About Kids today. You're all working with Community Action for Suburban Hennepin County, and this is a nonprofit organization that works a lot with poverty issues in the suburbs. And I think in the last few years, that stereotype of suburban Hennepin County being rich and not having many of the problems that we usually associate with the city has been dispelled a lot, but I think there are still people who aren't aware of how deep the problems of poverty really are in the suburbs. Karen, talk a little bit about what CASH is and some of the main focuses of your programs.
Sure. CASH runs a number of programs to serve low-income people, and mostly we focused really on housing issues because we identified that as a real need in the suburbs. A couple years ago, we started a Tenant Hotline that answers calls from tenants about their rights and their responsibilities as tenants, what to do if they are having problems with repairs or if they have questions about getting their damage deposit back and things like that. And we've just recently recorded our 10,000th call to that hotline. So it really is something that's a very high need because there's nowhere to go if you have any questions, and a lot of people just don't know.
How do people find out? What do you do to promote this program?
Well, we have a couple of different brochures about our hotline, and they're sent out to different social service agencies. There's flyers that we post. I don't know, Charlie, what else?
I think word of mouth is probably our strongest advertising vehicle.
We've got a couple of examples of the brochures, so someone who's had a real successful experience says, hey, call them, they're real, they'll help. Mm-hmm. They don't criticize. Well, Charlie, you work specifically with housing issues, and what's the stigma about housing that is affordable to people who are making, well, minimum wage or at the federal poverty level, which maybe you could even talk about how much money you have to earn to be considered living at or below poverty?
Well, I think the issue is more generalized, that there's and I think it pervades our whole national dialogue as a kind of a stigmatization of poor people just in general. And most of the folks that we deal with, particularly the tenants that we deal with, are lower income folks. And I think if you just listen to some of the national discourse, you keep hearing this recurring theme that a lot of the problems in our society are caused by low-income people and so forth. And that seems to generalize in the whole issue of housing, of course, is where people live, is where their neighbors are. They're going to be in neighborhoods, and people, I think, have an aversion to the folks that are different from themselves and people that are perhaps not from their own social class. I mean, there is that kind of a theme that runs through a lot of what we hear. I think there is some truth to the notion that because people don't have money, that they have problems in their lives. A lot of people that do have money maybe have problems, but they're able to deal with it by they can afford to deal with their problems. Low-income people oftentimes don't have they don't have family networks to fall back on. They don't have resources to deal with some kinds of problems that come up, and they tend to be focused upon by the media and by politicians too. I noticed that at the state legislature we do some work with tenant landlord laws and some other housing programs at the state legislature, and it comes through fairly clearly that many of the state legislators, because lower income people tend to be renters, and renters tend not to be politically active and to vote in any appreciable numbers, they tend to be disregarded or their importance diminished. And you hear that coming through in the dialogue on tenant landlord legislation and other programs for low income people.
That's sort of a scary thing. I think there's also a stereotype that renters don't take care of property, and there is an effort often to keep people out, perhaps people who have children, or people that just don't fit what we consider the ideal tenant. How do you handle those sorts of issues?
Well, I mean, the work that we do is trying generally to support the broader notion that you have to, in order to live a decent life, you have to have a decent home. And home means more than just having a roof over your head. I mean, the way that I think the relationship between the renter and the property owner is a real important one. Almost all of the calls, over 90% or about 90% plus of the calls that we get are low and moderate income people. The higher income folks that are paying high rent, that have landlords that are managing properties that can afford or that can charge those high rents, treat those tenants with, I think, more respect often than landlords that are dealing with low-income tenants do. And I think that breeds kind of a mutual problem, because if a tenant, for example, moves into an apartment, the landlord promises to make repairs that the tenant notices upon moving in, and then those repairs are not made, that begins to set up a kind of a pattern of mutual disrespect. And I think respect is a real important thing in people's lives that is often ignored, and the relationship between a tenant and a landlord can often work into a kind of a mutual disrespect problem. If issues that a tenant brings up aren't dealt with by the landlord, then the tenant says, well, they don't care about me, so therefore I don't care about this place. I'm not going to report it when the leak starts, or I don't care if my kid puts a gouge in the wall with a bike or something on that order. And you get that kind of a bad relationship that I think becomes really the fundamental issue involved with many tenant-landlord disputes.
So one of the things that Cash can do is kind of intervene in some of these situations, help tenants understand their rights and how to go about effectively working with a landlord so you don't get to this antagonistic situation.
One of the things that kind of evolved from the Tenant Hotline is a program called Tenant Organizing, which works with tenants in particular apartment complexes that are experiencing similar problems. And so our tenant organizers go in there and talk to them about, what's going on, what do they need to do, how can we talk to the property manager or the landlord to get some of these issues resolved? Do we need to pull in the housing inspector? Do we need to do anything else with the city officials? How can we kind of come to a resolution? And we've worked in a number of complexes in the suburbs. And really, when you're a low-income person in the suburbs, you often live in an apartment complex that is low income. There isn't a neighborhood that you point to. Like, I was in St. Louis Park and I was asking someone, well, what are the low-income neighborhoods? And they said, well, Meadowbrook. And Meadowbrook is an apartment complex. It's not, but it's also a neighborhood. And so if people are running into problems, that's the place to do some working with people. And I think in some cities in suburban Hennepin County, there's a real effort by the city to be working with apartment residents. We had a meeting with people from Richfield who are saying, how can we integrate apartment residents into our city? How can we make them feel more a part of the city? Just simple things like apartment residents don't tend to get the city newsletter. because it goes to people who pay the water bill, and therefore it doesn't go to residents. So, and there's a lot of good information in that newsletter that gets missed by residents, and we try to see how can we be an ally to that kind of work. In some other cities, they're not as supportive of low-income renters.
Which is a real problem, because all people in the suburbs who have low incomes are very isolated. Public transportation is pretty bad. If you live in a complex where you don't have a car, how do you get to the grocery store? There isn't that network of community support systems often.
Right.
That you find in other areas, particularly
true.
the city. Maxine, you work with people who are going to purchase their first homes or buy homes, and that's kind of an exciting thing, I would expect, for people who have lived in rental housing for much of their life, or perhaps their marriage. And how do people who earn low wages even aspire, kind of a lofty word, to having that little house with a white picket fence and so forth?
Well, the way we like to start out is with our 3-part workshop. That's a total of 7.5 hours, and that helps a prospective homeowner understand and take some of the myth out of the home buying process. They do their own pre-qualifying and start to identify what barriers they may have to home ownership, whether it's income, whether it's down payment, whether it's credit issues, negative credit or no credit. And after the course, then they're able to meet with one of our individual on an individual basis, one of our home ownership counselors, to develop what we call a corrective action plan. And we're prepared to deal with a lot of these clients for a very long term, maybe up to 2 years, to help them attain that goal. And part of attaining that goal is also working with the lending community in establishing programs that may be more lenient on their underwriting guidelines. A lot of our clients that are low income are very frugal and can manage a budget very, very well. It's just that they don't have a lot of money. So looking at outside of industry standards, maybe they don't have a credit card, but perhaps we can verify their utility bills or their telephone bill.
And do you find the lending institutions are pretty amenable to changing some things
Yes,
like this?
yes. There's been a great national effort on affordable housing. And also working with them on creating down payment assistance or entry cost assistance program and below market interest rates. Most of our clients are receiving anywhere from 5.5 to 6.85% interest, which really helps the affordability.
And one of the things that we've really worked on is to work with lenders to say, look at the suburban area. I know that Maxine has said there's some programs that are available in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and they're not yet available in the suburbs. And we've been able, through the work of our programs, to build those linkages to say, there are people out here in the suburbs, and there is housing that we can find that's affordable to them, but we need these loan products to be able to help them. So, we've really kind of created that impetus for doing more of that work.
Well, it seems like what you're doing is exactly what we all want. We want people to have that pride in their own home and the ability to care for it and to make the payments and to do, well, it sounds so kind of odd, but what you are doing is teaching people how to fish, basically, so that they are part of the community, they are part of the tax-paying public.
I think it's worth pointing out, too, that there are some municipalities in suburban Hennepin County, which is where we work, that are anxious to help in this area. There are a number of home ownership programs that some of the suburbs have developed, and we have helped some of them to work on their plans. The city of Crystal is one. Plymouth is another that's real interested in first-time home buyers. Eden Prairie is doing some work in that area. A number of the suburbs are, and Bloomington, you've been working with the city of Bloomington. I think that you could just count off quite a few of the suburbs that are beginning to recognize that this is something that they can assist with and are taking steps in that direction. The notion that poor, I think, that the stigmatization of poor people, I think, is one thing that is maybe it's is something that I think there are folks in municipal government and in the state legislature and in society in general that are attempting to do something about that. There are church organizations that have formed coalitions to work on municipal affordable housing plans that would provide more opportunities to people throughout the suburbs that are, as we speak, as the legislature in this month of May here is concluding its legislation, there are some bills forward that could promote the whole idea of allowing people more choices to live in the suburbs
Well, that's
affordably.
something that's been discussed. In fact, this is May of '95, and a couple of bills have been discussed, and perhaps they're not exactly perfect, but at least they're addressing the issues, bringing it to some public discussion. And probably by the time this program airs, the '95 legislature will be adjourned. But do you have any long-range thoughts on what might happen, if not during this legislative session in '95, but next year in '96?
Well, I've never been very good at forecasting because things always change so quickly, and especially now. I think that our country is going through a kind of a political dialogue that we haven't really seen in recent memory. So it's really hard to predict exactly where things are going to settle down, but there's really a strong thrust that for the idea of providing people with more opportunities, more fairness in choosing where they want to live, and so that somewhere along the line this is going to be moving forward, whether it's this legislative session or next. There's going to be some movement in this direction.
And perhaps some of the people with whom you're working by that time will have a little more political clout, and they'll be more participatory in the
Well,
whole
and I think there's a recognition that the metropolitan area is kind of an integrated entity. It isn't just the suburbs. It isn't just the center city. We're all interdependent one another, and I think that there's a growing recognition that if the core cities fail, then the metropolitan area is really jeopardized as well. So I think there's a recognition that we have to think beyond our municipal boundaries.
Absolutely. One of the things, we've talked a lot about affordable housing, but what about the problem of homelessness in suburban Hennepin County? Do we have homeless people? Families, do we have young people, minors, kids who've run away or for one reason or another aren't living at home anymore? What about this?
Well, we certainly do have people like that. One of the things about poverty in the suburbs is that it's not as visible as the city. If you're homeless and you have to stay in a shelter, you have to go to Minneapolis. You would go to the 410 shelter, or if a single adult, you'd go to a different shelter. But there isn't a shelter that you go to. I mean, what we do, one of the programs that we do is emergency services for people. Just for the city of Bloomington, we coordinate it. And there people are coming in for rent assistance or, bus tokens to get to the job or to their doctor or, pay their gas or utility bills. And emergency services is the kind of thing that is that step before you become homeless. We also have a project where we have hired an attorney to work with people at the Brookdale Housing Court if they're facing eviction, to help them kind of avoid that eviction so that they don't end up being homeless, because that's what you see is a lot of people having trouble paying their rent. They get evicted. It costs their property manager money to kick them out, and it costs them a lot of heartache because they do end up in the central cities because there really isn't a resource for them to stay here. I would imagine that you find a lot more of people doubling up with friends out here. They're staying with their brother or their cousin, so you don't really know. They don't get counted as homeless, but they're on the edge of that because usually they're staying with someone else who doesn't have a lot of resources either, and maybe they have kids, and so that's burdening that other household and creating a lot of stress and a lot of other issues that come up because of that. The homeless youth issue, I think, is one that is still kind of, there's not that many service providers in suburban Hennepin County who are dealing with that. There's Point Northwest that's up in the northwest part that tries to deal with runaway youth and tries to do family reunification, and then Teens Alone in Hopkins is kind of a coordinating place for runaway and homeless youth. But the main homeless youth providers are, again, in the city, and so if you are a kid in Minnetonka who's having trouble with his parents or whatever, you're going to end up most likely running to Minneapolis and hanging out in Uptown or that type of thing. So I think there's a real need to look at other programs outside of Northwest Hennepin, which I think is pretty taken care of, to look at helping suburban kids before they run to the city, before they get involved in prostitution or drugs or the kinds of things that homeless youth kind of run into. So
that kind of dispels a stereotype too, because we in the suburbs often think that we are paying so much for the problems that are happening in the cities, whereas actually the city is helping take care of some of the dirty little secrets in the suburbs.
I don't know if Karen mentioned invisible. I think a lot of our problems out here in the suburbs are invisible. One of our other programs is a post-purchase homeownership counseling program, also known as our foreclosure prevention program. And a few years ago in 1992, I did a study, or was it 1991, and I found that there were just as many foreclosures in Minneapolis as there were in suburban Hennepin County. Actually, there were more in suburban Hennepin County. So it's people just don't talk about those kinds of issues.
And that's the kind of thing that you'll see in suburban communities, is a family that maybe has stretched their budget pretty far to buy that first home or that second home that's nicer than their first home, and then who knows what happens. They lose their job, they're laid off, they get divorced. I mean, that house where they were teetering on it, they were spending all of their money to buy that wonderful house, and then something happens and they certainly can't afford that house. So we're seeing a lot of that, and again, that's a cost to the community. If that home is foreclosed on, that's a cost to the bank, it's a cost to the family, it's a cost to the community in terms of lost property tax revenue. I mean, so it's all those kinds of things. So when we're able to save a home and keep a family in there, it just has repercussions all the way down. It keeps the neighborhood stable, it helps that family, it helps the bank, So it's one of those things where we try to really promote those things where, hopefully everyone is happy with the solution here.
Well, again, the very practical, the economic vitality of an area rests on the ability of all of its residents to have good lives. So this is a very sensible, a common sense approach to dealing with issues of low income and poverty. In the spring of '95, you hosted a community forum to talk about, I think it was 20 years after the War on Poverty was the title, or that was sort of
actually
the focus.
30 years after
30
the War on
years.
Poverty. But
How we date ourselves. But what were some of the issues? And you involved poor people?
Right.
You involved legislators and policymakers?
We actually didn't have a lot
officials?
of legislators show up because it was quite a busy time in the legislative session, but we had some county commissioners there and some other city council members and some people who are low income, who are living in suburban communities, and asked them a little bit about what do you think helps people who are living in poverty, and what should we do? 30 years ago we said we wanted to have a war on poverty, so what does that mean? And I think one of the things that really came out of that is that we need to be able to have people join with each other more. There was a lot of talk about having mentoring programs so that low-income people could learn from other people who've been in similar situations, or learn how to be more of leaders in their community so that they can advocate on their own behalf as well as on behalf of people who are in similar situations. And I think one of the things...
Which implies a trust in the whole system, the legislative system.
Well,
yeah.
And I think there is a lot of anger, too, that the system as it is not treating them very well. A number of the people who were low income who were there were women who were on AFDC. So there was a lot of talk about ways that system could be improved so that, when they go to their financial worker, they find out about all of the resources that are available from the nonprofit organizations. Often, a financial worker's job is to do the finances and figure out, what do you qualify for, et cetera. And they're not trained, nor do they have the expertise to say, well, you have a college degree, but you need more job training, or you're interested in something like this, or you need childcare. Here's a resource. They're not. That's not their job. And
we think in such tunnel ways instead of breaking down the barriers between different agencies and departments.
And a lot of people are talking about that. I mean, this was not new news to me, at least.
But it's exciting when it keeps bubbling up all over the place, that there's kind of a collective recognition, oh, this is what has to happen. Not
Right.
one program is going to meet all the needs, but when all the programs work together. And we'll not use the dreaded C word, collaboration.
That's right. Well, everybody's doing that these days. But I think the most important thing about that forum was that low-income people had a chance just to sit with other people in the community and be an equal with them in discussing how to address poverty issues.
It's a lot harder to say they do this or they do that if they are sitting right next to you at
Right.
the table.
So that was real helpful, I think, for both the low-income people to be able to do that and other people to be able to hear their stories.
So do you think this is another one of the ways the word is going to get out, hey, this was okay, they listened to us, now they're going to do something about it? You think that that will be another way of helping some of your clients, the people who use the services of cash, participate more?
Well, that's the
goal.
That's the goal.
I mean, I think we have seen with the tenant organizing that certainly has mobilized people, both to work on the issue in their particular building as well as broader legislative issues. But it takes some work to provide some hope, first of all, to people that they do have control about some things in their lives, and that they can make a difference in their own lives, and then to give them the skills and the opportunities to do those kinds of things. So I think we've been really successful with tenant organizing to mobilize people on their own behalf, and hopefully we're going to do that on a broader basis with other low-income people who maybe want to be active on other issues besides tenant issues.
Well, childcare, all kinds of things.
Sure.
We've only got a little bit of time left, but has this changed landlords' perceptions of their tenants, or have you been able to develop better working? There's a stereotype, I think, of landlords too, the absentee landlord, the slum landlord. They're often perceived as being kind of mean and vicious, I think.
Well, those tend to be the kind of landlords that we get calls from tenants, and there is a problem that affects mostly the low-income folks that we're dealing with. And I think it goes back to this notion of respect. There's just kind of a lack of respect for folks that have low income. Is it possible that we could give a little plug for the
Absolutely.
hotline?
In fact, we'll put the hotline number up at the end of the program,
Fine.
but put in a plug.
Well, our housing programs go under the name of Homeline, and Maxine does the home ownership stuff, and we also have the Tenant Hotline, and the number is 933-0017 for tenants in suburban Hennepin County, and we really urge folks that are having difficulties, because we really can help.
And probably people from other areas you'd refer them back to their counties.
And if homeowners get that number and they call us, we can refer them to Maxine's programs as well.
For both,
Anyway.
if they want to buy a home or save their home.
Thank you very much for discussing such a topical issue, Maxine, Charlie, and Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
CASH is an advocacy agency that's obviously making a difference for residents in suburban Hennepin County. Thank you, Karen Kingsley, Maxine Timm, and Charlie Warner. And thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.